afternoon here in the UK, good morning in America, and good evening in the Philippines. And wherever you are in the world, hello and welcome to Effie Barker Human Interest. I am so thrilled today because joining us today is a veteran radio and print journalist who has exceptional talent in writing, most recently worked as a supervisor's deputy at the Los Angeles County Board of Supervisors. He's someone very dear to me, my former professor at the University of California in Los Angeles, or UCLA, Mr. Joel Bellman. Hello.
Good morning, Effie. Thanks for having me.
Good morning, and thank you for being here in my humble show and YouTube channel. I know you are very busy, so welcome. How are you, and how has it been during the pandemic? It's been almost a year since the last time I saw you.
It's hard to believe. Everything still feels very unreal here. Even though California has been doing a lot better than some other states, people are getting acclimated to the pandemic lifestyle. You know, more places are opening, but everybody is masked. Everybody is social distancing. Hand sanitizer menus that are scanned on the phone rather than handed out at restaurants. We're all kind of getting used to it, you know, in a weird way. I think people who aren't used to working at home and working in close quarters are having a hard time. My single friends are having a hard time. You know, the lack of human contact, lack of being able to socialize with your friends in a relaxed way is psychologically very tough for a lot of people. But more cars on the street, and there's more visible signs of economic activity. So it feels like we're slowly beginning to climb back, but there's still a lot of social isolation that's a problem for people, I think.
What do you think of the president's handling of the pandemic, or Governor Newsom?
I think the governor's been very good on it. I think he got a little bit ahead of himself around maybe June or July when the numbers looked very encouraging and they began opening up a little bit. I went back to my gym. We ate in a restaurant inside. But then the numbers started to go back up and they began closing back down again. And I think in California, at least, people kind of learned the lesson that you can't be too hasty about this. And they've been very measured and careful since then. You know, he's facing tremendous pressure to open up because a lot of people economically are hurting, apart from the psychological things that I mentioned earlier. But at the same time, they know from what the public health experts are telling them, and we know from experience, that if you open prematurely, you're going to spike the cases again, and then you're going to have to shut down again. On the federal level, of course, I agree. You know, I'm a partisan Democrat, and I agree with most Democrats whose handling has been absolutely abysmal and irresponsible from the beginning. I think probably most of your viewers here and readers heard, you know, the remarks that he made to Bob Woodward in the interview for the book Rage. Where he acknowledged in late January and early February that he had a much better grasp of how serious and dangerous the pandemic was than he let on in his public statements. And even that he's letting on in his public statements now. And he justified it by saying he didn't want to panic everybody and spook the market. But of course, here we are, 223,000 American deaths later, more than 8 million infections spiking at unprecedented levels in a lot of the red states that have been following his very reckless advice to ignore social distancing, ignore masking, keep staging outdoor events or even indoor events like the super spreader event for Amy Coney Barrett, his Supreme Court nominee at the White House, where, you know, a dozen or more people got infected. His wife got infected, his son got infected. And there's just a huge amount of denial about it. The New York Times ran an article, I think October 2nd, compiling all his statements about masks. You know, he insists publicly that he's, you know, doesn't have a problem with masks and he wears a mask when it's necessary and so on. But they listed like a dozen statements or more over the past many months where he's ridiculing it, he's minimizing it, he's not wearing a mask himself. He mocks his opponent, Joe Biden, for wearing the biggest mask you ever saw. And then he goes out and does his rallies without masks. They offer people masks. If they don't take them, that's just fine. If they don't want to social distance, that's just fine. You have the Sturgis motorcycle rally in, I think, South Dakota, you know, that was considered a huge super spreader event with hundreds of people got infected and then went out back home to the various states and infected more people. So we still don't have a grip on this, and it's still not being taken seriously at the federal level. You know, you see Biden everywhere wearing a mask. His wife Jill wears a mask. His staffers wear masks. They're very careful about the events that they have. And, you know, the president is clearly making a political statement by having huge rallies without the precautions.
U.S. president, you get a lot of attention. We get a lot of news about him here. But lately, I don't see much of an airtime for him anymore.
I think you're also seeing some of that reduced airtime and attention here too, because the American media are finally beginning to realize that they're getting tired of being played and manipulated. And the media realize that, you know, it's actually counterproductive to be broadcasting unfiltered and reporting credulously and uncritically about statements like that. It used to be that every time he would tweet something controversial, that would generate a new round of news stories. For the most part, his tweets are being ignored now. His statements at his rallies, even for the most part, are being ignored because they realize that just because he says it, in fact, it isn't news. They used to take the view that if the president says it, it is news. They realize that's not really true anymore. And unfortunately, he's squandered a lot of the credibility that the president, the office of the president traditionally had. You know, it used to be when an American president said something of either party, it was considered authoritative, serious, influential, and represented, you know, a consensus at the highest policy levels of the United States. I think we realize, and the world realizes, that's not true anymore. It doesn't even necessarily represent a consensus of his own staff, much less the leadership of his party or the U.S. Congress, you know, or others. That, you know, he's almost a rogue operative in terms of his opinions and his strategy, and it's, you know, he goes his own way, and that doesn't necessarily reflect where American policy is going or where other people think it should be going. So it just gets less attention now.
Right. You think what is the impact of the pandemic on the election?
That's a good question. I was looking at 538, you know, which is the, you know, a sophisticated news analysis and statistical analysis website here in the States that your viewers are probably familiar with. And as of October 25th, they did a series of studies, and they were looking at what the impact of the polling is. So let me look at some of the numbers here. As of October 25th, a total of 66.5% of those surveyed in the aggregate polls expressed somewhat or serious worry about where the pandemic is right now. 86% were somewhat or very worried about the state of the economy. So between, you know, 2/3 are worried about their health and where the pandemic is going, and more than 4/5 are worried about the state of the economy, which is a direct consequence of the pandemic. So that suggests a high degree of anxiety and dissatisfaction with current policies. 57.4% of those surveyed specifically disapprove of the Trump administration response to the pandemic, and about 39.7% approve of that. As you might expect, there's a very, very heavy partisan difference. 82.2% of Republicans approve of the way the president is handling the pandemic, while only 7.1% of Democrats approve of the way the president is handling the pandemic. So there's a very, very heavy differential of dissatisfaction depending on your party affiliation.
Yeah, I was about to ask, has this handling of the pandemic has changed at all?
I guess we'll know a little more after people finish casting their ballots and they're all counted, but based on the response, it seems, you know, his approval rating has basically been steady at around, somewhere between 40 and 43%, since April. Despite the ups and downs, despite the surges, despite the news, despite the change in messaging on the masking, despite his own infection and illness, despite the infection of all the other White House people, his approval rating more or less is solid.
Now, let me ask you that. Why do you think?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, I and many others have referred to his supporters as virtually a cult. And having done some investigative reporting on cults and conspiracy theories, I mean, real, authentic cults, people who have, strange beliefs and they live in isolated situations and they follow a leader like a kind of guru, whether it's Scientology or, the Lyndon LaRouche political cult or religious cults, I mean, genuine cults. His base really seems to exhibit what a lot of us who've studied cults consider cult-like behavior. In other words, their leader can do no wrong. They believe whatever he says. They think he's got an array of enemies that are out to undermine him, even though he's doing good work, that what he tells them is the truth. They believe what he says over, the quote unquote fake news. And his statements and their beliefs are so divorced from the empirical reality that the rest of us see that we can only describe it as cult-like. And it just doesn't seem like that base of support down around 40% or so is going to be budged by anything. I mean, we all remember what he said during the 2016 campaign, that he could go out on Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody and not lose any votes. And people found that a little weird and a little scary, but I think over the last 4 years, it's pretty clear that there's a significant portion of his base that would probably consider it justified self-defense if he just went out and shot somebody.
Right.
His exhortations to violence at his rallies, his incitements, his attacks on the media, his statements like, knock the hell out of that protester, telling the cops to be rough, with suspects, don't treat them so nice. These kinds of things are very scary and frightening, and Americans are not accustomed to this kind of rhetoric from a president. Maybe local politicians in certain extreme pockets, but never at the national level of leadership. We just have not experienced anything like this in our lifetime. And his base is not only okay with it, they seem to enthusiastically embrace it.
Next on Effie Barker, Human Interest.
He's almost a rogue operative in terms of his opinions and his strategy. And it's, he goes his own way, and that doesn't necessarily reflect where American policy is going.
Do you think by any chance Trump really had struggled in his decision?
I think he probably has struggled, but the struggle is not competing objectives of wanting to protect the economy and protect people's livelihoods on the one hand, and protect people's public safety and health on the other hand. That is a difficult straddle. He is so psychologically insecure that he's actually threatened by smart, intelligent, qualified advisors and experts who might know or do know more than he does.